we cut was auto theft. Right. We cut auto theft by 50% under the previous common sense Conservative government. And he's right. We did it at a lower cost to taxpayers. And he's also right that he reversed our reduction in auto theft because it has exploded by 32% since he took office, just as the bureaucracy has exploded. He has not put it into frontline officers. In fact, at the Port of Montreal, there's only 5 of them to inspect 500,000 containers, only 1% of which get inspected. Why won't he cut the high-priced consultants and bureaucrats and get boots on the ground?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It would be more credible what the Leader of the Opposition was saying if he hadn't voted against sending $121 million to the province of Ontario to fight against organized crime and car theft. If he hadn't announced that he's voting against our fight against money laundering. Mr. Speaker, he still has time to change his perspectives and get behind our initiatives to fight organized crime, to fight auto theft, and to stand up for Canadians. He cut thousands of jobs under his previous government from border services. We've invested in them, and we will continue to.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I'll say it softly and slowly so the Prime Minister can understand. We cut auto theft by 50%, by half. Yes, while reducing the cost of the bureaucracy. And yes, we're voting against him putting hundreds of millions of dollars more into high-priced consultants and back-office bureaucrats that don't stop crime. My common sense plan will scan every container going out of the 4 biggest ports and put 75 border agents to do the inspections on the ground. Why can't we have more boots on the ground and fewer bureaucrats in offices?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, again, he talks about boots on the ground, but the government he was part of, that he's taking credit for now, actually cut thousands of jobs of boots on the ground at the Canada Border Services Agency. We've continued to step up to support Canadians. They like to mention C5. It is a bill that kept mandatory minimum penalties for car thefts on the books. They mention C75, which is a bill that raised maximum penalties on car theft. We're going to continue to invest in fighting money laundering, and we hope, and organized crime, and we hope that the Conservatives change their mind and vote with us to crack down on organized crime.
Gotta keep sneezing because I'm smiling at bullshit.
Again, I'm going to ask all members, please, to restrain themselves as they could listen to the questions and to the answers. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
He's hiked the cost, he's hiked the crime, he's not worth the cost, and he's not worth the crime after 8 years. He's also not worth the hypocrisy. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been claiming for months that he had no involvement in or knowledge of the invitation of a former Nazi soldier to the visit of the Ukrainian president. Now we know that he personally invited that same individual. He actually said the opposite. And he said that the former speaker had to resign over doing the exact same thing. So will he hold himself to the very same standard and admit that he's not fit for office?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The attacks that the Leader of the Opposition is choosing to make against the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress demonstrates the extent to which this Conservative Party no longer stands with Ukraine. They have an opportunity in just a few minutes, Mr. Speaker, to stand and vote in favor of a free trade deal that Volodymyr Zelensky himself is asking this House to pass, and he is choosing to not stand with Ukraine, not stand with Ukrainians, and not stand with Ukrainian Canadians. Why are they abandoning Ukraine?
Order. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Yesterday, the Bloc Québécois tabled its bill to remove the religious exemption, which allows one to be hateful using religion as an excuse. Violent people have used the excuse of religion recently in order to support a terrorist organization. This time, though, will the Prime Minister vote to eliminate this religious exemption when it comes to hate speech and incitement to violence? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I fully agree with my honourable colleague. I agree that hatred and glorification of violence are totally unacceptable. The Minister of Public Safety is in constant communication with the RCMP. Local law enforcement will not hesitate to take action if necessary. Canada is a country governed by the rule of law and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We, as Canadians, need to stand united against hatred, no matter what form that hatred takes. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. In order for law enforcement to act, they need to be enabled to do so by law.
I don't think there is an exemption, though. I've never heard of anything like that.
Last time, the Prime Minister denied it, sent the issue back under the rug, said that freedom of expression is an important freedom, as he just did. But this religious exemption, though, we have sought to fight it in a bill to criminalize hate speech. But it's not a crime currently because people can use religion as an excuse. Will the Prime Minister support our initiative? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in Canada, all forms of hatred and glorification of violence are unacceptable. Our law enforcement agencies and our legal system are working very hard to, in fact, eliminate hate speech and glorification of violence. We recognize how important it is to defend the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the rights of all Canadians. We do not stand for hate speech or glorification of violence. That is always unacceptable.
South.
The Liberal government, the Prime Minister promised to tax the excess profits of corporate grocery stores if they fail to stabilize grocery prices. Well, they failed to stabilize prices, and the Liberals again broke their promise. The Liberals announced instead another study on food prices. Canadians don't need another study to know that they're being gouged by corporate greed. It turns out we've learned the Liberal housing minister received thousands of dollars in donations from none other than the Sobeys family. Is that why they're protecting their wealthy friends?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, more competition means lower prices, more choice, and more innovative products and services for Canadians. Our government has just passed new legislation that empowers the Competition Bureau to hold grocers accountable and prioritize consumers' interests. The fall economic statement also cracks down on predatory pricing, and I urge all parties to vote in favour of that. Canadians are watching and counting on each and every single one of us in this House of Commons to keep supporting them.
Then I have
the Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Today, the Liberals bragged about announcing another study of grocery prices. Canadians don't need another study. Canadians need prices to go down. The minister promised to tax excess profits, but the minister broke their promise. The housing minister received thousands of dollars in donations from the Sobeys family. Is the minister breaking the promise in order to make the IGA CEO happy? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, when there is more competition, Canadians have access to lower prices, more choices, and more innovative products and services. Our government just adopted an act so that the Competition Bureau can demand that grocers and grocery chains give them information and protect the interests of consumers. We are fighting against excessive and abusive prices, and I encourage all members of this House to support our legislation. Canadians are watching us. They are counting on the support of every member of Parliament here in this House of Commons.
Hill.
After months of feigned outrage and apologies on behalf of everyone else, a new report by the Globe and Mail shows that the Prime Minister's office invited a Nazi to his diplomatic reception in Toronto. He blamed the Speaker, saying that he acted alone. He's saying he had no idea about any of it. He called for him to take responsibility. He watched him resign, and yesterday he tried to blame the Ukrainian Congress. After all of the embarrassment, all over the world. Why is he above the rules that he applies to everyone else?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about is
He won't stand up and answer the question.
name that came from a community organization. Obviously, the Prime Minister had no knowledge of this, but here we know what is happening over here. We are voting today at third reading on the Canada-Ukraine free trade arrangements. Mr. Zelensky stood there and asked us to pass this. Their opposition to this bill is a moral failing of historic proportions in response to an effort to support our friends in Ukraine and repel the Russian invaders.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
What an embarrassment it must be for the House Leader to have to clean up the Prime Minister's mess every day. The invitation had the Prime Minister's name on it. It came from him, and for months he said only the Speaker invited him. It turned out not to be true. His own House Leader said that the invitation merited a Speaker's resignation. The Speaker resigned because of him, and all of them watched him do it. So will the Prime Minister be subject to the rules that he imposes on everyone else?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Again, Mr. Speaker, another small conflagration to mask their larger historical moral failing of not supporting the people and the armed forces of Ukraine and the President of Ukraine, who stood in this very chamber not months ago and asked us to support the Canada-Ukraine free trade arrangements. Then they voted against Operation Unifier and support for our troops that once again supports Ukraine. What is next, Mr. Speaker, and why will they not stop trying to hide their moral failings?
There are several experienced members of this House who do know that their time to speak will be recognized by the chair when they are supposed to speak. Otherwise, I ask you, please, to allow questions and to allow answers to be given so that the Speaker can hear it and so can anybody else who's participating here. The Honourable Member from Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that was a shameful answer from that member, Mr. Speaker. Another day, another international embarrassment. After months of denials and throwing the former Speaker under the bus, now we learn that it was the Prime Minister who invited a Nazi to a reception with President Zelensky. He forced the Speaker to resign, to take the fall, so he could avoid responsibility and cling to power. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, he is not worth the cost to Canada's reputation. Why did the Prime Minister invite a Nazi to a reception with the Ukrainian Prime Minister?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
You look sick.
The community event was held with the President of Ukraine, to which
You look
over
like you had a hard
1,000
time
people
getting that
were
out.
invited. In fact, some conservatives were invited to that, Mr. Speaker. But we're not talking about any of that today because they care about this. They're pretending to care about this. This is fake outrage. Why? Because today we are voting on trade arrangements with one of our closest allies, the people in the country of Ukraine who are repelling as we speak and dying against Russian invaders. This is a moral failing of historic proportions, Mr. Speaker.
Said the same thing 3 times.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. The Prime Minister just keeps misleading this House. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told this House on September 27th that he had no idea that a former Nazi would be involved in the events surrounding President Zelensky's visit. But now we know that the Prime Minister had personally invited that Nazi to his private reception in Toronto. He said that the Speaker of the House should resign for inviting a former Nazi to the House of Commons. After 8 years, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's relationship with the truth is pretty skewed. Will the Prime Minister apply that same standard to himself and ask himself to resign? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are talking about this. Why are we talking about this in the House today? It's because they are about to vote against a historic agreement between Canada and Ukraine at a time when both countries want to strengthen each other and strengthen their trade ties. We want to support them to get Russians out of their native land. This is a moral failure from the Conservatives, but they're trying to hide their moral failure when it comes to supporting Ukraine by bringing up this new issue. So will they stop their moral failings and vote in favor?
From Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a breakdown in law and order in this country. Over the last 8 years, auto thefts are up 34%, violent crime 39%. Canada has become a foreign interference playground for the PRC, for Iran, and for Russia. And behind all of this is organized crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing. In fact, in a U.S. indictment unsealed last week, Iran hired 2 Hells Angels members in British Columbia as assassins. When is this government going to get serious about crime in this country and start protecting Canadian citizens?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I've got a lot of respect for the member for Wellington Halton Hills, but I ask him to reflect seriously on the vote he's going to cast on the fall economic statement. The fall economic statement deals directly with the money laundering that is fueling organized crime. We know that auto theft and so many other crimes right now are being committed and orchestrated by organized criminals. We have the ability to get tough on their financing structures and break down those organizations. That member hopefully has the rectitude to address that issue and vote against his leader's instructions and vote in favor of the fall economic statement.
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, Bill C-59 will do little to combat the problem of organized crime and money laundering in this country, which the government's own estimate says are $133 billion a year, equal to 5% of GDP. This government has ignored numerous reports and protected lawyers from money laundering and terrorist financing law and failed to crack down on Canada's big banks and their funneling of money laundering and terrorist financing through our financial system. So when is the government going to subject lawyers to federal law and start cracking down on our big banks and the gobs of money laundering going through our financial system?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, again, I would ask that member to use the reason for which he is known in this chamber and reason and think about the votes that he is being asked to cast and the votes that he has already casted. What am I talking about, Mr. Speaker? We know that from police forces around this country, they are asking for resources. We've dedicated resources to guns and gangs, $121 million last week. Yet that member, under the guidance of his leader, was instructed to vote on an all-night voting session against guns and gangs funding. That is not becoming of that member nor of that caucus.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, the 3 Federalist parties voted against requiring bilingualism for commissioners reviewing miscarriages of justice. The Liberal Parliamentary Secretary and the NDP justified abandoning bilingualism because it would hinder the hiring of unilingual francophone commissioners. Oh, come on. Unilingual francophones have never benefited from bilingualism taking a back seat. Believe me, Mr. Speaker, are these parties really trying to tell us that it's impossible to find 9 bilingual and competent jurists among 40 million Canadians? The Honourable Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada. Mr. Speaker, judges in Canada are incredibly important. The work that they do is incredibly, extraordinarily important. Requiring bilingualism is a priority, not just for judges in Quebec, but for judges everywhere in Canada. When we took office in 2015,
he's talking about the jurors,
we reviewed the process of appointing judges, and we made bilingualism a priority for us in assessing candidates. Thank you.